With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. I am Sabrina Halvorson, joined by Lorrie Boyer. Now, Lorrie was telling me off mic as we get right into it this morning about an interesting story she was reading about our squirrels in California. Lorrie, what's going on?
Yeah, I was scrolling through just some news headlines on my MSN, so I'll credit them because that's where this information is coming from. And I don't have a lot of details, nor did I look up a whole lot of details. So here's what I found very interesting, and I don't know why, because I guess you and I are squirrely sometimes. Squirrels are becoming carnivorous. And by that, I mean they're starting to eat other animals. Typically, they eat nuts, right? Typically, they eat some of the vegetative sources that are around them. But they have been found to be hunting. This is what's even stranger: hunting, killing, and eating voles. VOLE. I know what those are. I haven't talked about those for a long time, but voles are like, they look like little mice, I guess, but little creatures. And the reason researchers are calling them, let's see if I can say this word, opportunistic omnivore, because squirrels are more flexible in their diets than researchers realize. So it took researchers this long, I guess, to figure out that
that they can eat and digest actual meat instead of just plant proteins and things.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe I watch a little bit too much sci-fi lately.
Yes.
So.
I can't even tell you. I'm fascinated and yet disturbed by this. The thought of squirrels heading out and, hunting down other animals and ripping into them. And yes, I like I said, fascinated and slightly disturbed. It's a little troubling.
It is. And I would say that squirrels, I'm going to venture to just guess squirrels are probably one of the most known animals. Everybody knows what a squirrel is, no matter where you live, because they're all over. They're in rural areas. They're in all different geographic locations across the country. They're in urban areas. They're right outside your door. So how many of us associate squirrels with eating another animal? That is disturbing.
Right. It's not something, and maybe, like you said, maybe I watch too much sci-fi and a little bit of horror. So all I can imagine is now the squirrels are plotting their takeover. You know?
It sounds like the theme of your next book.
It does. Yes, it does.
Now, I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna say I can do something with that.
How widespread this behavior is, we don't know, but we're seeing this in California right now. So I'll be interested to see if researchers in other states are seeing the same type of behavior. But it is also interesting that researchers are really paying attention to this and the fact that it made national news.
That is actually very interesting. And it brings to mind some, more serious questions, although albeit not too serious. But, are we witnessing evolution in the squirrels? Whereas, like you said, we've always thought of squirrels as being purely vegetarian with eating nuts. But are we witnessing, in real time, the evolution of a species?
Yeah, I would guess so. It would make sense to me. We're seeing all kinds of different weird things here as our country changes, as the climate changes and all this stuff. So I guess it would make sense that this would evolve into carnivorous animals.
Gosh, I don't like the sound of that a bit.
I don't either.
All right, so we have kind of a fun segment. So, with it being the start of Christmas week, so what we're going to do is we're going to take our break a little bit early, and then we're going to come back. We're going to switch topics with, we're going to get off the squirrels, although, as Lorrie mentioned, we are a little bit squirrely this morning. But this is the AgNet News Hour. We will be right back. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. I am Sabrina Halvorson here with Lorrie Boyer.
Good morning.
So it is the kickoff to Christmas week, and I know you and I both really enjoy Christmas, and so I thought that maybe we'd spend a couple of minutes just talking about Christmas, and I brought up some Christmas traditions from around the world that are rooted in agriculture. And, I've done a couple of stories on this in the past, looking at how agriculture has been embedded into our Christmas traditions. If looking at things that we do, not necessarily from a religious standpoint, although there were some traditions that I found that kind of combined religious, the religious celebration of Christmas with some agriculture. One of them is in Slavic traditions, they will place straw or hay underneath their tablecloth at Christmas Eve for Christmas Eve dinner. Like in Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, places like that. This straw is supposed to represent the manger where Jesus was born, but also it represents the agricultural roots of their community. And it wishes for, it's supposed to bring about abundant crops and fertility in the fields for the coming year. And I thought that was really an interesting
Wow.
tradition.
I had no idea.
Yeah. I like to see how agriculture is so often put into our lives, maybe in ways even people who are not involved in agriculture are taking part in traditions like this without necessarily knowing their roots, but really it's all a celebration of ag. Not to say that Christmas is, a celebration of ag. Obviously there are, religious reasons for Christmas, but I love seeing that we celebrate agriculture within it.
Well, Jesus was born in a barn, so he was born around agricultural products and livestock. So there
True.
you go.
So, okay, have you ever heard the song that starts off, "Here we go a wassailing among the leaves so green"?
I have, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I even will sing that song in my head, and I've never known what wassailing means. And I don't know why I never bothered to look it up before, but I've always been very curious what the heck is wassailing. So apparently, wassailing is in parts of England during the 12 days of Christmas. People gather in apple orchards to wassail the trees. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but they sing, chant, and sometimes pour cider onto the roots, making noise to ward off evil spirits. And so the ritual is to ensure a healthy apple crop and a bountiful harvest in the coming year.
Wow. I'm learning all kinds of stuff from you this morning. I just thought it was some sort of like a waltz,
Yeah,
like
I
a
don't know.
dance. Yeah.
I always thought it meant like you're going Christmas caroling. Maybe it was
Hmm.
something strange, but no, it's actually this tradition for the almond orchards where you're, you know, supplying, healthy, I don't know, is cider healthy for apples? That's almost feels strange. But
But it
what's the
does
word?
make sense because we
Yeah.
call it wassail. You want a cup
Yeah.
of wassail? Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So here we go, a wassailing. Yeah, it's all about celebrating the apple orchards and ensuring a healthy apple crop for the coming year. Here in the U.S., our traditions aren't quite as ag based in a lot of them. But if you think about, I like our decorations this year. I dehydrated orange slices and
Oh,
strung them up and hung them around the house in different places. Honestly, it was something I saw online. I thought, wow, that's really beautiful. I'm going to do that this year. Normally, I go way overboard on the Christmas decorations, but this year it's all just natural pine that I collected from outside
neat.
and
Uh-huh.
dehydrated orange slices. And that's I don't know if it's always been very popular. I know that it was a very long time ago when that's what people had to decorate, but I
Mhm.
know that this year it seems like online everybody's doing it. So I have to say I'm a follower on that one. But it is really beautiful. And I love the idea of bringing agriculture into my home during the holiday season.
Right, right. Wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I have seen that too. Some dehydrated oranges made into like garlands,
Hmm.
or people make them into coasters with that clear hypoxy stuff. I have seen a few of those things too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've always like have seen people that will string up cranberries to
Yeah,
wrap around the tree. I have never done that. Have you ever done that? Cranberries or maybe popcorn?
I have. Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah.
It seems like that would be so tedious. How do you do that?
With a needle and thick thread. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it is tedious, but I guess it's one of those traditions you do with your family and have fun doing it.
Yeah.
Throw
So
popcorn at each other.
that's true. I would prefer I love popcorn. I would just prefer to eat the popcorn. So what are some agriculture or not agriculture, but I'm curious, Lori, what are some things that you really love about this season?
Well, you bring to the table some good information, some facts. I was just going to bring to the table that it is speculated that Rudolph has a red nose because he probably had a parasitic infection in his respiratory system. That's what I got for you.
Okay, so I know a few things about reindeer, and believe it or not, is one of my weird things. But reindeer actually can get red noses in the winter. It's the body's natural defense system against freezing. So when it gets very cold,
Mm.
they will like pump extra blood to their nose, and they've got their blood vessels kind of close to the surface. And so they will appear more red, kind of like how we will get a red nose if we're
Hmm.
cold or whatever. Same thing for reindeer. And they can actually get, quote unquote, a red nose from that too.
Or they have a parasitic infection.
Right.
One of
Or
those
they have a
things.
parasitic infection. Also, Santa's reindeers would have been female, because all reindeer shed their antlers. Male reindeer shed their antlers earlier in the season. So by the time Christmas comes around, they
Oh,
have no antlers. And so since all of Santa's reindeer have antlers, that means they're female.
that actually makes sense. I think I kind of knew something along those lines. Yeah,
Hmm.
I remember I've done a few interviews on reindeer in the past too. Yeah, because they're
Yeah,
very hardy animals, very
they are.
overall easy keepers. I understand they're kind of docile and slow and don't get too worked up, and but very hardy. They winter well, they go through the summer well.
Yeah. So I have a secret desire. Maybe it's not secret. I talk about it all the time. Uh, I really want to be a Christmas tree farmer.
Oh,
I
well, there
I
you
feel
go.
like that should be my life. I should be a Christmas tree grower. I would probably be horrible at it, but I don't know. It just seems like I'm really drawn to. I love the idea of having a Christmas tree farm.
Yeah, maybe you can plant some in your backyard.
Maybe. I'm not great at growing things that take a long time.
Then I'm not sure this would work out for you.
No, no, probably not. I just I just had on the show in my segment
Ah,
a few days back, an expert from North Carolina on Christmas trees. North Carolina is one of the main
mhm.
states
I didn't
where
know
we
that.
grow Christmas trees in the nation. And he was talking about the detail and the work that goes into it. You know, they spend the first 2 years of their lives in the nursery, and then they're able to be transplanted out or put in pots outside, and then bigger and bigger pots until they're transplanted into the ground. And by the time we get the Christmas tree, if you want a tree that's like 6 feet tall, well, that tree is probably 8 years old. So it's taken.
Oh,
They grow about a foot a year or 2 feet a year. So it's a long process. It takes dedication.
wow.
All right. So with that, it is time for us to take a break. Now, before we head to the break, I just want to let our listeners know that since it is Christmas week, you and I are going to be taking some time with our families. So over the next few days, they will be hearing some of our best of episodes. But we will be coming back live next Monday, and we just hope that everybody has a fantastic Christmas.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She's Lorrie Boyer, and we'll be right back. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. How do humates, and specifically those produced by Live Earth Products, help with greenhouse gas emissions in farming practices?
So the interesting thing is that I like to say it's unique to us, but it's not. Humates and organic matter do a very interesting and very important task in the soil, and that is retain nitrogen. Now, what happens is when farmers apply nitrogen, not all of it is obviously used by the plant. And so some of that nitrogen is lost in multiple ways. It's lost, volatilized, mineralized, or converted. And what happens is some of those converted gases are released as very potent greenhouse gases. And so by the organic nature of humic acids and humates, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, reduce those conversions. Therefore, you get less of those gases created. Now, what's interesting is there's a double dip here, because a lot of times these nitrogen products are created through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That Haber-Bosch process relies on fossil fuels to create those and fix those nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So by reducing your nitrogen utilization, you also reduce those carbon emissions that are created during the creation of that fertilizer. It's a double dip. You save the fertilizer that you're applying, and you're also reducing your carbon footprint by reducing nitrogen loss.
So, with that in mind, tell me a little bit about what exactly Live Earth does.
So typically farmers were using our humates or our liquid humic acids with their nitrogen products. And what that does, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, let that plant get a longer opportunity to use that before that nitrogen is lost, volatilized, or converted. And the technology is not unique just to nut crops. It's used with every nitrogen product. We've got some really neat university trials using our humic acid with a liquid UAN32, and it's a liquid nitrogen it can be lost in the nature just due to inefficiencies and poor storage in the soil.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
Today, my guest is James Walker. He is the Chief Executive Officer of a company called Nano Nuclear Energy Incorporated. James, to get us started, tell us more about yourself and about the company.
Sure. So my background was as a nuclear physicist and nuclear engineer. I got my start with the UK Ministry of Defence, working in things like the design of and the building of secondary systems for submarines. And I moved from there to do further qualifications in nuclear physics and nuclear engineering. The government sent me off to go and do that academic work. When I completed that, the government seconded me to Rolls-Royce, where I worked in the reactor physics department, in the design of the next generation of nuclear reactors for the next generation nuclear submarines. And then from there, I moved to thermal hydraulics, where I was involved in the design of the thermal hydraulic system that goes into the reactors that goes into the current class of submarines. So I did that until I was promoted out of that role where I then began to work on much larger projects as a lead project manager, building facilities to mass manufacture reactor cores for submarines. And I was the country subject matter expert for nuclear fuel reclamation for the government, and the chief engineer in charge of the replacement chemical facilities for nuclear fuel reclamation. So I did that for a number of years until I moved to North America. I got more involved in capital markets and public companies, but I was also still doing things like facility design, manufacturing operation building. But through my capital markets connections, I met the founder of the company, JU, and together we started Nano Nuclear Energy just over 4 years, or just about 4 years ago, with the intention of trying to build a business that would fit into the least developed areas of the nuclear industry.
All right. Now tell me what Nano Nuclear Energy is.
When we started the company, we had a look at the nuclear landscape and where we could fit in best. And we saw that in the nuclear industry, that most of the development would seem to be in the small modular reactor area. And that was reactors that really range in power from, say, 20 megawatts all the way up to 470. And they're principally catering towards things like powering cities and towns. But we saw there was this potentially enormous market out there for microreactors to basically go to remote areas, because in these remote areas, you were only competing with remote diesel, which was very expensive. And whereas SMRs would still have to compete with gas, coal, wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, microreactors only had to compete with these diesel generators. And they offered a much better prospect as well, because a microreactor gave you 10, 15 years of continuous power, whereas diesel generators needed a regular diesel shipped in almost on a daily basis. So we knew that there would be a big market here, potentially $1 trillion market, because there was this island communities, military bases, remote habitation, remote industry, mining projects, oil and gas, all of these areas that needed a lot of power in remote locations. And that could even apply to population centers that needed desalination, energy for housing. So we started down this route. I think as we became very different, what happened was that we realized that the fuel supply chain in the United States had atrophied to a great degree because of reliance on Russian weapons-grade material that the US was buying. And the arrangement there was that the US and Russia had agreed mutually to decommission a lot of its weapons, but that led to the Russians having a lot of material that the Americans agreed to buy. But that also led to underinvestment in things like enrichment facilities, deconversion, fuel fabrication. And we saw this as a major bottleneck because some larger SMR companies were having a substantial issue with sourcing the necessary fuel to build their reactor systems. So we started speaking to the Department of Energy and other big SMR companies about what their solutions were. And we realized that there weren't any great solutions being proposed. And so we began an effort to build a Cat 2 fuel fabrication facility, the only one of its kind in the country, building fabricating non-triso fuel. And then as we did that, the DOE made us a founding member of the HALO consortium, which was set up to address this sort of issue in the United States of having to build back this infrastructure. And through that HALO consortium, we actually met an enrichment company that we then invested very heavily into. And we found them personnel. We were incubating them in our Tennessee laboratories at the moment so they can do their work to build this. And Nano also agreed to build the deconversion and fuel fabrication facilities for that. And the good thing is that we've now put into place the supply chain that will give us our fuel for our reactors, but also a much larger business to sell fuel to the entire industry. And it's the prospect here is that we could be first to build back this US infrastructure that gives the country what it needs to realize the sort of nuclear resurgent interest, the sort of nuclear renaissance, as it's being called. And the good part is we want everyone to succeed because this will give us an ability to supply everybody, and hopefully with material that's cheaper than they would have expected. We've been building now very significantly. We're actually part of the DOE LEU award. The LEU stands for low enriched uranium. It was a $3.4 billion award awarded to 6 awardees. Our enrichment company was one of those. Nano was the principal subcontractor. So we've got access to 10 years of DOE funds of that 3.4 billion pool to build out these facilities of really good personnel. So.
I'm talking here today with James Walker, Chief Executive Officer of Nano Nuclear Energy Incorporated, and we'll be right back. Welcome back as I continue my conversation here today with James Walker, Chief Executive Officer of Nano Nuclear Energy Incorporated. As we talk about your technology in the agriculture industry, it looks like you have partnered with a vertical farming company called Vert to grow energy solutions. So let's talk more about how this can be applied in the agriculture space.
This actually came about because when we announced we were building the microreactor, we received a significant amount of interest from island communities, African countries, and they were principally looking to try and replace diesel generators in remote locations. But a lot of these locations actually, because it's the same kind of communities where they have to import diesel on a daily basis. They're also the sort of communities that have to import food on a daily basis as well. So, for instance, when we were in Rwanda, we signed an MOU with them very recently. They told us that 60% of the country has access to consistent power. But a lot of the communities that are dotted around the place, there might be a community of 1,000 people, 2,000, where it does not make sense to run power transmission lines to. So they subsist on diesel. But that also means that these communities do not have enough energy to basically create food or desalinate water. So that's all brought in too at great expense to the government. So in these communities, they were obviously looking for power systems to obviously give these communities power for hospitals, for accommodations, for remote industry, but also for food. And when they began talking about this, we began some of our discussions with vertical farms and companies to try and find the best fit. Because the idea here is that when we build our prototype, we'll demonstrate that the prototype can power these vertical farms. And the fortunate part is that the energy drawdown for a lot of these vertical farms is not a significant amount of the total power of the microreactor. So if it is a community of 1,000 people, 2,000 people, 3,000, we could still supply them power that could be used for industry, for medical facilities, but also a small section of that could be utilized then for food. And so what we would like to do is basically offer a package, especially to places like Africa, or in island communities, like the big ones are places like Indonesia and Philippines that we're talking to at the moment. They've got hundreds of millions of people dotted across hundreds of islands that all subsist on diesel, but they could also benefit hugely from this power source and these vertical farms being put onto areas where acreage is the most important factor, and they might be limited in their ability to farm because of the small footprints available to them. And the fortunate part is that with vertical farms, it's not soil dependent, it's not environmentally dependent, It's basically power dependence and water dependence. And if we can provide, even if the water is a real issue, desalination along with that, then this creates a package we can offer to, well, thousands of locations across the world to have that power source coupled with food supply too. And the interesting part here is that it can essentially create independent regions where they were very dependent beforehand on imports, and that led to all sorts of issues for these groups, and countries, which is why they were very interested in the product. Because if there are adverse weather conditions with boats, food doesn't get there, diesel doesn't get there. In winter, you might have issues with blizzards that stop, say, northern Canadian communities getting diesel and food and that kind of thing too. So it's a huge prospect for us and Vert to grow to do this, but it's got a beneficial humanitarian element to it, because it should improve the quality of a lot of lives as well as while we're doing this.
What kind of infrastructure would be needed to utilize nuclear power in a vertical farming operation?
So we wouldn't need some sort of big grid system, but say, for instance, if it's already had a diesel generator there in the past, you will have some sort of microgrid. And the idea here is that we would obviously supply the system that could just replace that diesel generator and plug in straight to the microgrid. In areas where diesel generators have never been deployed for, we would also have to look at installing a sort of a microgrid as well. It can produce heat or it can produce electricity. So if you need industrial heat for plants and things like that, it can do that. But it can easily switch to electric within the system that we deploy within the ISO container. But if it's electric, then you do need that microgrid to be installed, and that microgrid can also obviously connect up to the vertical farm. It can be as simple as that. The reactor itself was designed to be able to be moved into an area and be put down and plugged in, and that was the totality of it. And the reason for that was that the economics of deploying a reactor would be killed if you have big infrastructure and construction projects, and they might not even be feasible in some areas. Like if you're supplying to the middle of Alaska in winter, you can't have people constructing sites for a reactor to be installed permanently. That's true for disaster relief areas where we hope to deploy the reactor to. The reactor has to be able to come in and be put down and plugged in, and that's the totality of it. The only addition to that would be the introduction of microgrids in areas where they've never utilized that power before. But in areas where they've lost power, like in a disaster like Puerto Rico, for example, when that got hit, those grids were still intact. It was just the power systems that were damaged. So the reactor would still be able to be moved in and put down. And actually, in those kind of hurricane hit areas or disaster relief areas, vertical farms could be installed alongside that to provide food. So the area was not as dependent on imports of food during its rebuilding.
All right, we have limited time left. So what are some other important points that you want to get out there today?
The microreactor unlocks a lot of areas before that were previously not off limits to humans, but like it just was never practically or economically feasible before. And that was because of the prohibitive costs of these remote diesel. For the first time ever, like for instance, when we speak to a lot of these African countries, they were incredibly mineral wealthy. But a lot of this mineral wealth is in remote areas where it's not economic to mine. This could unlock a lot of wealth in these communities, but coupled with that, as you're unlocking a lot of wealth and human capital, which has been cut off from being utilized, you can introduce these farms into these areas too. So civilization could effectively, it could certainly be distributed a lot more easily with this tech.
On that, we wrap up. Once again, my guest here today, James Walker, Chief Executive Officer of Nano Nuclear Energy Incorporated. I'm Lorrie Boyer, and we'll be right back with Sabrina Halvorson.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. How do humates, and specifically those produced by Live Earth Products, help with greenhouse gas emissions in farming practices?
So the interesting thing is that I like to say it's unique to us, but it's not. Humates and organic matter do a very interesting and very important task in the soil, and that is retain nitrogen. Now, what happens is when farmers apply nitrogen, not all of it is obviously used by the plant. And so some of that nitrogen is lost in multiple ways. It's lost, volatilized, mineralized, or converted. And what happens is some of those converted gases are released as very potent greenhouse gases. And so by the organic nature of humic acids and humates, it helps stabilize that nitrogen and reduce those conversions. Therefore, you get less of those gases created. Now, what's interesting is there's a double dip here, because a lot of times these nitrogen products are created through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That Haber-Bosch process relies on fossil fuels to create those and fix those nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So by reducing your nitrogen utilization, you also reduce those carbon emissions that are created during the creation of that fertilizer. It's a double dip. You save the fertilizer that you're applying, and you're also reducing your carbon footprint by reducing nitrogen loss.
So, with that in mind, tell me a little bit about what exactly Live Earth does.
So typically farmers were using our humates or our liquid humic acids with their nitrogen products. And what that does, it helps stabilize that nitrogen, let that plant get a longer opportunity to use that before that nitrogen is lost, volatilized, or converted. And the technology is not unique just to nut crops. It's used with every nitrogen product. We've got some really neat university trials using our humic acid with a liquid UAN32, and it's a liquid nitrogen it can be lost in the nature just due to inefficiencies and poor storage in the soil.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
For this segment, we're going to be talking about drones, the kind of drones used in agriculture. Joining us is Arthur Erickson. He is the CEO and one of the co-founders of Helio. All right, Arthur, for our listeners, would you just start out by telling us a little bit about Helio?
Yeah, I started Helio with three of my fellow co-founders back in 2015 while I was studying aerospace engineering at UT Austin down in Texas. And in a nutshell, we design, build, and then provide autonomous crop treatment drones. So these are larger drones, not the little camera drones that most people are used to seeing, but these are drones in the 3 to 4 to 500 pound range, and they're delivering agricultural payloads such as pesticides, fertilizers, seeds, etc., with precision and accuracy, and again with the help of our software, which makes them autonomously operate.
All right, and you made an important distinction there, explaining that these are large drones. These are not the smaller drones like that we've been hearing about so much in the news recently.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because any other week, the DJI stuff in the NDAA would be the biggest story about drones, but not this week. This week, there's apparently a bigger story.
Yeah, right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, what you mentioned with having this legislation that can affect drones with DJI. Would you, for our listeners again, would you please explain first off what it is and how it can, affect your industry?
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of background on it. Hopefully, it's not too dry, but essentially, Congressional Representative Elise Stefanik out of New York back in 2023 proposed a bill she called the Countering CCP Drones Act. And essentially, what the language would do was it would revoke FCC licenses from DJI's products once this law went into effect. And ostensibly, it was because Elise Stefanik, along with many other people in the U.S. government, believed that DJI is a national security threat for many reasons. So that has been negotiated by the House and the Senate over several rounds of deliberation. And as of, let's say, 2 weeks ago, I believe, it finally made it into, or a version of Stefanik's bill made it into the NDAA for fiscal year 2025 final text, which will be voted on by the Senate, and after that would presumably be looked at and possibly signed by the president. So that's expected to happen over the next 2 to 3 months. But I say negotiated because it's not quite the same as what Elise Stefanik first proposed. It's slightly different, and I'll explain that difference now. Basically, DJI is still explicitly named. Another Chinese company called Autel has now been added as well. And so this language now states that the Congress will form a committee to inspect whether or not DJI and this other company, Autel, do in fact pose a national security threat. And if they do, then they are mandated to put them on the FCC covered list that I had just mentioned, which would revoke their licenses, which would effectively make them inoperable, right? Because these drone products need communication to internet, cell infrastructure, etc. Their controller needs to communicate over radio signals to the drone. So if they have no FCC license, they can't operate. They're effectively banned. And one little caveat is if the committee that Congress forms doesn't make a decision within a year, then both DJI and Autel are automatically placed on this FCC covered list. So it's you can almost look at it like they're, in this case, guilty until proven innocent, because it's presumed basically, unless some action happens to stop it, that they will be put on this list and be virtually prohibited from operating.
So, can you explain more about what DJI and Autel are as far as what kind of businesses they are? Are they building the drones?
Now, DJI and Autel are both large China-based companies. So DJI is the largest drone manufacturer in the world, accounting for an estimated 70 to 80% of the drones in the global market are of DJI make. Autel is also a large company, but relatively much smaller than DJI. So both of these companies primarily produce drones that are used for cinematography, so for gathering videos and images for media, but they're also used widely in the US for all sorts of stuff that would involve drone imagery. So that could be crop scouting, that could be emergency response, so searching for victims in a disaster relief scenario, or searching for perpetrators in a law enforcement scenario. So they're used by both the private and public sector pretty extensively across the US and across the world, actually.
So, what kind of a threat? I mean, I can kind of use my imagine and guess what some lawmakers are thinking, but what kind of a threat could they pose?
Yeah, I've had to talk about this a few times, as you might imagine, and it's
Hmm.
always frustrating because I, like you, I'm just a normal civilian. I don't have any access. I'm not privy to any confidential information or classified information, and if I was, of course, I wouldn't be able to talk about it with you. So the U.S. government, through various memos internally, as far back as 2018, essentially the Department of Homeland Security, I think at that time, sent out a memo basically stating that they had strong reason to believe that DJI drones and Chinese-made drones generally were being used to siphon data, critical data about our infrastructure. Basically, what you would consider geopolitical or military intelligence was being gathered by these drones, not just drones being used by military personnel in the U.S., but even drones being used by private citizens. They had reason to believe that all that data was somehow feeding back to China in a way that could harm the U.S. And so at that time, they essentially mandated that the U.S. government doesn't buy or utilize Chinese drones. That again was all the way back in 2018. So what's different about what's happening now is that this would now extend to everybody. I mean, this would be a ban on DJI products and Autel products in any scenario, so private or public operator. So it's escalated a bit, but this isn't anything new. This fear of these Chinese drones, and so it's obfuscated, I think, for national security reasons. The U.S. doesn't, they can't really reveal exactly what is vulnerable and what's been exposed, but you could see by their actions that they have really strong reason to believe that this is actually an imminent threat from a data security standpoint, and so they've made these moves to try to remove them from our market. So, long story short, we don't know as private citizens exactly what has been taken in terms of data that's been stolen or leveraged to hurt us. We just see that the government is very worried about it. So that's all we can go off of.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So I'm curious for your company, for Helio, would this have much of an effect on you?
Yeah, it would in fact have a huge effect on us, and every drone operator or business in the United States is going to be affected pretty heavily by this. And so for us, it's of course leaning towards the positive side. I would be lying if I didn't say that this helps us in a lot of ways. Essentially, uh, on its face, what's happening is the largest competitor in the space by far is being removed, or at least hindered. And it's not that I don't support competition from any country. I personally support drones on the market being from China, from Europe, from the United States, etc. But that's the point. I want them to be from a multitude of different sources because I believe in true free market competition and that delivering the best value to the end user, the operator. So DJI has, in my opinion, had a virtual monopoly on the industry just because they were first to the punch. They are very well funded, and there's controversy about whether or not the Chinese government actually directly funds them, and we can get into that later. But that's some speculation, some stuff that's actually been put forth by the U.S. government. But anyway, I think just at least temporarily removing them or slowing them down is ultimately good for the market, because it gives companies like Helio and other US manufacturers, and again European manufacturers, etc., a chance to just show their stuff and make an honest case for whether or not our tech is truly competitive, the same if not better than these Chinese made drones. And if so, the American people should have a choice on whether or not they want to purchase and use them. They want to use Chinese drones, by all means, right? But there should be an option, right? And we're not really there right now because DJI has had this, in my opinion, predatory monopoly. So it's lifting that monopoly and giving us a little bit of room to breathe here.
We're talking with Arthur Erickson this morning about Helio and also about drones used in agriculture. We will continue the conversation right after this quick break. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, and we'll be right back. We're talking with Arthur Erickson this morning. He is the CEO and one of the co-founders of Helio. Back to the comment that you kind of made about whether it's DJI is funded by the Chinese government, and I don't know, and I've not put any research into that, and I won't ask you to say it or not, but if that were the case, I can see how that would be troubling. But even if it's not the case, to have such a large company, from another nation that's so well funded, that is hard to compete against. Even if everything else in the playing field is level, that's real hard to compete against that kind of backing for a big company like that when you are, the American company that's trying to get your stuff out there.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I'm harping on it, but it's all about choice for me. I want to be I want to have an equal opportunity in the market to present our case technologically and say, this is how we do it. Buy it if you want it, or buy the other stuff. But yeah, if we allow DJI and other large companies to keep basically using bully tactics in the market, then we'll never have that ultimate choice at the consumer level.
Right. So I'm curious if the potential ban would affect like technological innovation or research and international collaboration within the drone industry. Do you think that it could have those kinds of effects?
Yeah, I think it's gonna lead to an increase in collaboration, and this just is in addition to our monopoly conversation. DJI is, at least from my perspective, they don't really play nice with other companies or organizations. That's not really their style. They're just a big juggernaut that keeps growing and growing and growing and vertically integrating more and more stuff. So they like to keep everything just the DJI ecosystem, a bit like Apple, right? That's a somewhat fair analogy. And so they operate like that. Whereas in the West, I'd say the drone companies and academia and whatnot have a much more collaborative relationship. We work with universities to make improvements. We collaborate with a bunch of other companies that supply certain components like batteries, motors, etc., that we utilize in our systems. So I think it's like for sure more of a rising tide raises all ships mentality here in the West, and getting rid of the big bully on the block, I think would just allow people to come out of their shells, so to speak, and work together a bit more harmoniously and in a spirit of fair competition versus just everyone being cowering in fear and not really being able to make any moves in the market.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and chatting with us about this.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for your time.
That is our show for today. This is the AgNet News Hour. Now, don't forget, for the rest of the week, you'll be hearing some of our favorite recent interviews and segments. Then Lorrie and I will be back next Monday with a new show. From Lorrie and myself, from our families to yours, we wish you a very Merry Christmas.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.